The phone rang, its harsh sound slicing through the stillness of my office. I had been sitting there, staring out at the city below, my mind racing. I reached for the receiver, my hand just a little unsteady, but I couldn't allow it to show. "Hunter," came the voice on the other end. Cold. Direct. "Your son, he's gone too far." My pulse skipped, and my eyes narrowed. I sank back into my leather chair, the weight of everything I'd built pressing down on me. The city lights twinkled beneath me, but the wealth and success that had taken me a lifetime to build now felt like a cage. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice quiet but firm. A storm brewing beneath the calm. "Timothy," the voice continued. "He's working with your competition. Trying to take everything from you, maneuvering through the courts, with the IRS, using your name, your business. It's all planned, Robert. Clean. Perfect. And it's already happening." I could feel my blood run cold. My son. My only son. The one I had poured every ounce of my energy into. And now this. I gripped the edge of my desk, my jaw tightening. My heart didn't race. It didn't skip a beat. It just slowed down. Cold. Calculating. "Who else is involved?" I asked, my voice steady, though something inside me was shifting. The life I had spent decades building, the trust one had placed in my own flesh and blood, was crumbling. But I wasn't going to let it fall. Not without a fight. "People you never thought you'd have to face again. People from your past. They know everything about you, Robert. And Timothy, well, he's leading them all. He's already made the first move. It's time to make yours." There was a silence on the line. For a moment, I just sat there, still holding the receiver. My hand trembled slightly, but my heart remained steady. My mind clear. The voice on the other end had ignited something deep inside me. "I've spent my life winning," I whispered to myself, my voice low but full of resolve. "And I'll be damned if I lose to my own son." I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "Prepare the old team. It's time to remind them what happens when you cross me." I hung up the phone, and as I did, a surge of clarity washed over me. This wasn't just about betrayal. It wasn't just about money. It was about survival. And I, Robert Hunter, a man who had fought and won wars, wasn't going to let his son destroy everything I had built. The game was on. I sat in my office, the faint light of the night beginning to touch the corners of the room, and suddenly, the thought struck me, how much time had passed since I last truly looked at my life. I don't remember the last time I listened to myself, instead of the voices calling me to fight, on the battlefield, in business, in life. No matter how much I've achieved, there's always that emptiness, the one that can't be filled by victories or glory. I've never truly been there. Not for her. Not for him. And now, I feel the consequences of it. When I started my career, I was full of ambition. Straight out of university, I joined the army. It seemed like the right path, to be part of something greater, to defend the country, to be among the best. I became one of those ready to give everything for service. Quickly climbing the ranks, I gained respect from my peers, but the price was high. Every step upwards pushed me further from home, from family. When I met Claire, she was young, vibrant, full of enthusiasm. She believed that despite my long deployments and endless hours at work, we would be happy. But as the years went by, she grew distant. I lived for work, for my career, for success. And although I always promised myself that tomorrow I'd be better, tomorrow never came. When Timothy was born, I felt it was a chance. I promised myself I would be there for him, that I would try to be a better father. But my work was the same unstoppable enemy as before. I came home only to find myself overshadowed by business. Timothy often asked me why I didn't play with him, why I had to work on weekends. Claire tried to support him, but she was alone. I understood that I was losing something, but I didn't know how to stop it. There were moments when I returned home from a long deployment, and Timothy seemed like a stranger. I saw how his eyes grew colder, how he withdrew into himself. I, however, kept forgetting what it meant to be a father. I was always busy, and he, my son, was becoming a stranger. When I left the army and decided to start a business, it was the natural next step. Defense contracts, military technology. I knew this world, and I felt I could succeed. And indeed, success came. The business grew, money flowed. I became a respected figure in my field, but here's the paradox. The more successful I became in business, the more I lost in my personal life. Claire left me a long time ago, and I didn't fight for her. Her departure became just another milestone on the way to my goal, success. I didn't want to admit that I lost not only my wife but also my son. Timothy went off to university and stopped contacting me. He became just as abstract as the rest of the life I had built, calculated and patient. I kept working, thinking that in time, everything would work itself out, that I'd be able to get back into his life when I had the time. But time turned out to be something that slips away. And now, years later, I look at it from a different perspective. He decided to take revenge. He chose to strike at everything I built. His betrayal wasn't all that surprising, to be honest. All these years, I distanced myself, never realizing how his feelings toward me were changing. He was a baby, and I was a commander. He was a child, and I was a cold professional. When he was a teenager, I was too busy to see that he needed a father, not a business partner. And now, when he turned against me, I understood that it was too late. I remembered the last time he left the house. I sat in my chair, and he stood at the door, silent and grown. We didn't hug, we didn't say anything, and maybe that was the last moment when we could have changed something. He left, and I continued my life. But now, his return brought a blow I wasn't ready to face. He had become part of this world I had created, but he changed the rules of the game. And now, I had nothing left to do but respond to his challenge. My lawyer's words still echoed in my mind, like repeated echoes, coming back again and again. Don't make hasty decisions, he had told me. We need to act carefully, without emotion. We must gather all the evidence, prepare a strategy, and only then move to countermeasures. He warned me that rash actions would only accelerate the process I was trying to stop. But I knew that waiting wouldn't help here. I sat in my office, and despite all the advice, I needed to act. Too much was at stake. They had already started moving. If I didn't respond, I would lose everything I had built over the years. I, like anyone seeking power, couldn't afford to lose any more. I thought about the next step. I ran my lawyer's words in my mind. We can't act immediately, we need to proceed step by step, carefully. All those words rang in my head, but I knew that without decisive action, I would lose. I needed more than just legal protection. I needed to regain control. I called my lawyer again. He was a respected professional, and his advice, as always, was measured and cautious. But now I understood I needed more than caution. We started working on a plan to gather information about my son and his partners. The lawyer began to dig deeper into all the legal aspects of how Timothy planned to take my business, but I also knew that just a legal investigation wouldn't stop him. I had to think beyond that. Remembering my old connections in military intelligence, I realized that I had to be prepared for a more complicated game. This wasn't a situation where I could simply sit back and wait for everything to fall into place. I was a military man, and that meant I had to act with strategy. I reconnected with my old contacts, and soon arranged for help from those who had once worked with me. They had the information that could be decisive. I needed more than just defense. I needed to strike, and strike smartly. Every day, I received more information about how Timothy was using my reputation and connections to undermine the business. With every step he took, I had to think deeper. The lawyer, despite his caution, was beginning to show me how to prepare for a serious legal battle. But I knew we couldn't just handle this with ordinary legal protection. Robert, he said, his voice tense, we need to act carefully but quickly. They're starting to use not just your business, but also your personal connections. We have to be prepared for any move on their part. His words made me think. I knew we had to safeguard our assets, But the decision I had to make was more than just a legal strategy. This was a move that I had to make with full calculation, not just to defend myself, but to put them in a position where they would begin to make mistakes. They were playing their game, but I was going to change the rules. "We need to find out where their weaknesses are," I said to the lawyer. "We'll find ways to use their mistakes against them. I'm not just going to defend myself. I want to destroy them." He agreed, but reminded me that it was important not to rush into actions that might provoke unnecessary conflict. We began to develop strategies, considering all their potential weaknesses. But I knew this wouldn't be enough. Too much was at stake. Soon I found myself relying more on my military connections and experience. I used every resource I had to make the right move. This wasn't just a legal battle. It was a war, and in this war, I had to stay several steps ahead of the enemy. Every move now mattered. I knew I had to wait for the right moment before striking. Later that evening, I met with the lawyer again. We discussed all possible scenarios, and I realized it was time for the decisive step. I was ready to act. This wasn't just about rights and money. It was about my life. I couldn't let everything they wanted to take from me slip away. I knew that Timothy and his partners never expected such a response. They thought everything would go according to plan, that I would fight with traditional methods, using lawyers and legal maneuvers. But I was ready to play my card in a way they didn't anticipate. My first move was simple. I started manipulating the financial flows, and for that, I didn't need anything extraordinary. I knew that the key was to weaken their economic base, because without it, their strategy would collapse. Using my old connections in financial circles and with the help of my lawyers, I arranged a series of tax audits for Timothy's company. We deliberately provided documents that could raise suspicions with the tax authorities. I managed to engage reliable people who knew how to create real financial chaos. Simultaneously, I arranged wiretaps, monitored key deals and transactions involving his partners. I even spread rumors within their business circles about Timothy's company possibly being in financial trouble, which triggered even more concern among investors. When the tax audits began, their effects were immediate. Companies that Timothy worked with started losing trust, and the reputation of his business became questionable. I kept track of the process, sitting in my office while my old contacts kept me informed of every development. Every move Timothy made to fix the situation was predictable. His company began facing increasingly serious financial problems, and with each passing day, he was losing more and more clients. I knew his nervousness and rush to solve the problems would play into my hands. But the real game began when I saw Timothy starting to lose his connections. His business partners were increasingly rejecting his proposals, and investments started slipping through his fingers like sand. He began throwing money around, trying to solve the emerging problems, unaware of who was behind it all. I watched him get anxious, losing control. Even his top employees started doubting his ability to handle the crisis. One day, I sat in my office, watching the reports on the financial flows. My employees were providing me with every new step Timothy was taking to fix the situation. He was cornered. Not only was he trying to deal with the tax audits, but now he had to rebuild trust among his partners and investors. But without the proper resources and connections, his efforts were doomed to fail. I knew that now I had to watch him struggle. He was trying to stave off the financial pressure, patching up holes, but every new move was leading to even more of a crisis. He was spending money on consultations with lawyers and financial advisors, fixing the consequences of the audits, but he didn't realize that his problems were the result of my actions. With every passing day, his reputation worsened, and his partners began to see that he was no longer the man who could run a successful business. He was growing more and more nervous, rushing to fix things, but he could barely prevent the consequences of my steps. Meanwhile, I watched his efforts with cold calculation. This wasn't just a business game, it was a war, and I had decided to use the strategy of economic exhaustion. I let him waste his money and resources on dealing with external issues so that he couldn't focus on what really mattered, restoring his reputation and fighting what was already inevitable. But although Timothy didn't understand who was behind his misfortunes, he began to suspect that his problems weren't random. He started to feel that someone was manipulating his movements, that everything happening was planned. His suspicions started growing, and he began to link his failures to someone close to him, to me. He couldn't understand how I could have done it, but I knew he would have a hard time finding another enemy than himself and me. One of my informants told me that Timothy had even asked his partners if I could be behind all of this. His suspicions were becoming more and more obvious, but he still couldn't put all the pieces together. He tried to find connections and evidence, but my steps were carefully concealed, and every mistake he made only accelerated his fall. I relished this moment, watching him begin to understand that his world was crumbling and that it wasn't by chance. I wasn't his enemy in the usual sense. I was the one who made him face the consequences of his own actions. He had become the victim of his own decisions. But this was just the first step. And I still had many moves to complete this game. It all started with Timothy calling me himself. He was beside himself, his voice coming through the receiver filled with fury and resentment. "We need to talk," he said, not asking if I was ready for the conversation. I knew this moment was inevitable. We agreed to meet in my office, but I knew this meeting would be less about business and more about personal matters. Everything I had done in the past weeks, everything that had led me to this moment, it was all about to come to the surface. This time, he wasn't just my son trying to understand why his father was always absent. Now, he was my enemy. When he walked into my office, I immediately noticed the way his face twisted with anger. He was lean, but his walk was still decisive. He threw a glance at me and sat down across from me without saying a word. I didn't waste time and opened the conversation first. "You thought you could do this without consequences?" I said calmly, knowing my words would strike him. "I know everything, Timothy. About your betrayal. About how you made deals with my competitors. You thought you could control everything, but you didn't count on me." His eyes flared with rage, and he jumped to his feet, as though stunned by my words. "You don't understand anything. You've always been about work. You never cared about family, about us. You built your business, but forgot that I was your son. You've betrayed us all, and now you're complaining that I betrayed you?" I could feel his words cutting through me, but I couldn't let go of my position. I saw his fingers grip the edge of the table, his chest rising heavily with anger. He was sure that by accusing me of never loving him, of abandoning him, he could change the narrative. "You're wrong," I replied coldly and without emotion. "You've always been second to me. I built all of this so that you could live in comfort, but you decided to destroy it. You chose to tear everything down. That's your mistake, Timothy. And now I'll fight for what's mine." He paced back and forth, unable to hold back his fury. He didn't want to understand that his actions had led us to this point. He kept trying to manipulate the situation, to justify his choices. "You thought everything would go according to your script, that everything would go your way," I said, letting the tension grow. "But everything you built is falling apart. You can't control it all, and now you'll pay for your mistakes." I knew this was the moment where he wouldn't accept the truth. He had always been proud, but now his pride had turned into fury. He couldn't understand that his own decisions had made us enemies. He blamed me, but in reality, he was the one who led us here. "You're blind," I said. "You don't even see that all this time you've been betraying me. You allied yourself with people who were willing to destroy everything I've worked for. But I won't give up, Timothy. I'll take it all back. And you'll sit on the sidelines, watching your mistakes become your downfall." He stood before me, his face contorted in anger, but I knew now that I held all the cards. He was losing touch with reality, and I was the one who could steer this game in the direction I wanted. He had intended to destroy me, but I was ready to do everything to reclaim what was taken from me. "You won't beat me," he said, his voice trembling, but I could feel him starting to realize that he was losing control. I looked him in the eyes and spoke the final words of the conversation. I won't lose, Timothy. You may hate me for it, but I will fight until the end to take back everything they wanted to take from me. You may think you've won, but you've only made yourself an enemy who will be stronger than you ever imagined. He was silent, and I knew that he was no longer confident in himself, as he had been before. His confidence began to crumble. He realized that his actions had led to this moment, and now he couldn't escape the consequences. He stood there, with anger and resentment on his face, but in his eyes I saw fear. And it was that fear I had been waiting for. Fear of his world collapsing, fear that his efforts were in vain, that everything he had done would be destroyed by my actions. We both remained silent for a while, but I knew this meeting had been pivotal. He no longer had control over the situation. I had made my move, and now there was no turning back. It had been a few weeks since I had faced my son directly. All of this game, this conflict, seemed like a small episode in something much more significant. I knew that if I wanted to regain control, I had to act firmly and strategically. This was not just about money or business, this was a war, and I wasn't going to lose. I began to recall my old days in the military. Back then, on the battlefield, every move had to be calculated, each step was part of a larger strategy. Now, I was going to apply those same principles to this business conflict, to trap my son and his partners in their mistakes and manipulations. Instead of directly attacking, I started manipulating the situation, creating threats for their business. I knew that their key resource was their trust-based relationships, their clients, contracts, and business connections. If I could destroy those links, they would be doomed. I started acting like a military strategist, not to capture, but to destroy. I created a network of operatives who could subtly sabotage their deals. These people acted as undercover agents. In one case, they were supposed investors, in another, potential partners who created false hopes for Timothy and his partners, offering lucrative deals, but ultimately leading them into financially unprofitable situations. I knew how they operated, and my people took advantage of their weaknesses. Each move was carefully planned, starting with manipulating their financial flows. Fake companies began to withdraw funds from their accounts, transferring money to places where it could be easily frozen. Simultaneously, I ensured that leaked information about their business dealings started circulating. Reports from external auditors were tampered with, leading to financial losses and legal consequences. Gradually, I started to see their business crumble. First, they lost contracts with major clients, and then their partners began to pull out, citing uncertainty. I knew that their true downfall would come with the loss of trust, and I was right. My agents were also conducting operations by influencing the behavior of competitors. The information they sent appeared to be a random leak, but in reality, it was a carefully orchestrated step designed to create the illusion of chaos within their business. Companies they worked with started panicking, as no one wants to be involved with a business that could collapse at any moment. My son's reputation was falling with each passing day. Soon, I began to notice how the atmosphere in their offices was becoming more tense. Timothy and his partners couldn't understand what was happening. Nothing they tried to explain seemed to make sense. They started losing control. Clients canceled contracts, partners pulled out of deals. With every passing day, they sank deeper into problems that, as they thought, were just random, but in reality, were part of a carefully devised strategy. I sat in my office, watching the reports, and with each new step, I could feel my plan unfolding. Every action I took was leading to their downfall, and now they had nothing left to do but struggle with things they could no longer control. When one of my agents told me they were starting to suspect interference, I knew the time had come. With every step, I was closer to the finish. They were losing their confidence and beginning to ask themselves who was behind their misfortunes. Timothy felt that everything was falling apart, and perhaps he was beginning to understand that it was his father behind it all. But he couldn't believe it right away. I knew this moment had to be his catastrophe. When his own mistakes and the external forces I orchestrated finally destroyed his empire, he would realize who had been behind it all. I was watching their every move. In every deal, every step, every failure, I was there. They were starting to panic, and I knew that now I just had to wait for the moment when they would begin to unravel, accusing each other, and blaming themselves. And then, with all that chaos, they would be in my hands. I knew Timothy wouldn't back down. He had always been determined, but now, as his world was crumbling, he was ready to do anything to regain control. I didn't like how he was moving, not the way I would have wanted, but I knew he wasn't going to give up. He tried to manipulate the situation, attempting to undermine my reputation and prove to everyone that I was no longer capable of managing my business. This was his last card. I knew he would raise questions about my age, my mental health, and would start looking for ways to challenge my competence. He thought that if he could make the public doubt my ability to run the business, he would have the chance to take it back. He reached out to lawyers, psychologists, and began searching for any means to prove that I was no longer fit to make decisions. When I learned that he had filed a lawsuit, I wasn't surprised, although it still caused me some concern. He started claiming that I was mentally incapable of managing my business, that I had lost touch with reality. He invited experts to confirm his claims. He was counting on the fact that I wouldn't be able to respond to this challenge. But I was prepared. I knew that if he decided to go down this path, I would have to be ready like never before. I immediately began protecting my reputation. I gathered all the necessary evidence, independent medical exams, psychological evaluations confirming my competence. Everything Timothy might use against me, I had already anticipated. I wouldn't be in his shoes if I wasn't prepared for this moment. On the day of the trial, I entered the courtroom with calmness and confidence that came from years of experience. I knew that this trial wasn't just another legal battle. This was his last weapon. I sat there, still and confident, while he tried to unleash a torrent of accusations against me, but everything he said lost its power. I knew my evidence would be ironclad. My lawyer calmly and confidently proved my competence, while he, my own son, lost his confidence. His attempts to manipulate the situation became more helpless. "We've undergone medical evaluations," my lawyer said. "My client is fully competent. Not only is he capable of managing his business, but he is also physically fit." "This lawsuit is absurd." I heard him, his voice faltering, trying to respond, but it was clear that he couldn't hold his ground. He thought he could make everyone believe his lies, his manipulations. But I knew I wouldn't let him. I could see his plans crumbling, his confidence fading right before my eyes. When the judge handed down the verdict, I already knew it would be in my favor. I felt the weight lift off my shoulders, the tension ease, and I knew that this battle, where Timothy had tried to oust me from the game, was over. While I sat in the courtroom, I saw his face become blank, as though he realized that everything he had hoped for was now destroyed. He couldn't believe that I hadn't given up. I saw his confidence melt with every word from the judge, every rejection of his demands. When it was all over, I felt a sense of calm. I knew that he wouldn't be able to manipulate me anymore. I was ready, and despite his last-ditch efforts, I had stood my ground. This court trial had been the climax of everything that had happened between us. It was Timothy's final attempt to take back control, but it ended in failure for him. I hadn't just won, I had shown that I was willing to fight to the end to keep what had been taken from me. I sat in my office, bathed in the soft light falling on the paper before me. The room was silent, and the only sound breaking the stillness was the click of my pen as I signed the documents. I looked at the will. My decision was already made. Everything I had built was now in my hands, and I was ready to take the final step. My efforts, my manipulations, my moves, all of it had led me to this moment, where I could sever all ties with what once mattered most. In the end, I knew that the only way to teach my son to appreciate my work and sacrifices was to take away from him what he so desperately wanted. He had been so consumed by dreams of inheritance that he never understood how much I had given for the business, for his future, for the family. But none of that mattered to him. He had tried to destroy what I created, and now I had the chance to show him that the values he sought to destroy were far more important than any inheritance. I turned the page and picked up my pen again, preparing to sign the final clause. This time, instead of leaving all my wealth to my son, I made the decision that might have seemed cruel. I gave all my money and business to charity. It wasn't just an act of vengeance. It was a lesson. I didn't want him to live with illusions about how everything would fall into his lap. I wanted him to understand that material wealth could never replace the respect, effort, and devotion to those who truly deserved it. When I signed the last lines, I felt a strange but liberating silence. This was the end of not just a legal battle, but of a long path I had walked. In this moment, I didn't feel rage or vengeance. I only felt cold satisfaction. I won not because of anger, but because of calculation and patience. The door to my office suddenly opened. I raised my gaze, and there he stood, Timothy. He was agitated, his face twisted in a mixture of rage and despair. He probably felt that everything was already lost, but he still hoped he could change something. He was sure there was still a way to take back what had been lost. "You can't do this," he said, approaching me. His voice was almost full of desperation. "It's not fair. I was your son. I deserve this." He looked at the documents on my desk, and his eyes widened when he realized what had been signed. His face turned pale, and he took a step back as if in fear. I didn't respond immediately. I looked at him, trying to understand what it felt like to be a person who destroyed everything they had because of greed and hatred toward their own father. But I knew he would never understand. He stood in front of me, but we were so far apart. "You tried to destroy everything I built," I said finally, with a cold calmness. "You didn't understand why I did it. You only saw money, but you never saw the sacrifices I made for this business, for our family. You wanted to take it all, and now it's gone. You've lost not only my trust but also the meaning of what I left." He was silent. His face was full of defeat. I knew that his dreams of inheritance had crumbled, and that was his punishment. But not just punishment. This was a lesson he had never realized, that there are more important things in life than money and power. "You can be angry with me all you want," I continued, calmly putting the documents into a folder. "But you'll have to learn to live with the fact that your dreams of inheritance are now empty. I'll give everything that was once yours to those who truly deserve it." Timothy tried to say something else, but I didn't listen anymore. He still didn't understand. He left, and I stayed sitting in my chair, feeling his footsteps fade behind the door. This was the end. I had won. But not because of rage or vengeance. I won because of calculation, patience, and understanding that in life, what matters most is respect and hard work.